Thank you, Gregor. Thank you for the Chicago Humanities Festival for inviting me to this. I'm very pleased to be here. And most of all, I'm honored that you all have come out to hear what I have to say this afternoon. So thank you. I hope what I have to present is interesting to you and valuable for you in living your life and thinking about how the world works. So as we've heard here, the theme of the festival is power. And one of the powers in the world today, as we all know, is religion. So that's what I want to focus on and talk about here, the power of religion. Now, up until the mid to late 1970s, thinking about religion in academia and in the world in general was the following. Most thinkers expected religion to decline and perhaps die out as societies modernized, meaning the more modern a society becomes, the less religious it becomes. The theory describing this in academia is called Secularization Theory. The more modern, the more secular. Well, a funny thing happened on the way to secular society, and that is a major religious resurgence in the late 1970s and through the 80s, which hasn't stopped since then. Now, the religion was always there. It's not like it went away and then came back. But its public face, the public expression of religion, really all over the world, a whole series of events showed people who believed in secularization theory they were basically wrong, or they weren't entirely right. So what were some of these events? Many of you in this audience, I'm sure, can remember these, but thinking about some of these faces. We're talking about everything from Jerry Falwell and the emergence of the Christian right. In South Africa was an anti-apartheid movement in the 80s, led by many religious figures. It wasn't a secular movement, it had secular dimensions, but many religious leaders are involved in this. The Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran overthrew in the late Jimmy Carter era secular Shah of Iran and replaced it with an Islamic Republic, which the United States is still wrestling with every single day now how to deal with and respond to. In the late 70s, a Polish Pope was elected, John Paul II, and played a significant role in what was eventually to become the falling apart of the Soviet Union, confronting, first of all, helping to confront through the Solidarity movement, which was a very religiously infused movement. It was a very Roman Catholically infused movement, Solidarity, confronting the communist government in Poland. And then totally other continents in Latin America. We had a progressive church, if you've heard of liberation theology. Throughout Latin America in the 70s, most of the governments became authoritarian, became dictatorships, and there was a massive violation of human rights in Latin America. All of the institutions of Latin American society that could have resisted these dictatorships were repressed, were done away with, except for one. The church, especially the Roman Catholic Church, could not be totally done away with. And so the church took up the role in the 70s and 80s in Latin America of the major defender of human rights, of ordinary citizens. And this, if you know who that is anybody know who that is? Yeah, it's Archbishop Oscar Romero of El Salvador, who was gunned down by the powers that be while saying Mass. And anyone know who these are? Yeah, Catholic religious sisters who were murdered in El Salvador for defending the people, for sticking up for human rights and so on. Here we have who knows who that is? Anyone? Ernesto Cardenal is a Catholic priest in Nicaragua who served as the Minister of Culture under the Sandinistas in Nicaragua. So what we see here is a whole array on lots of different sides of political spectrums of religious actors suddenly being geopolitically and economically and in many ways very important actors in the world, and people thought religion's disappearing like the dinosaurs. What's all this about? And then this, of course, continues into the 80s and beyond, where the moral majority morphed into the Christian coalition. It doesn't always have to be political. Here in Brazil, huge spread of Protestantism in Brazil, and they have hundreds of thousands of marchers every year in the sort of parade for Jesus thing going on, and it doesn't have to be Christianity. The Dalai Lama is a significant global player. The Saffron Revolution, Buddhist monks leading resistance against the repressive military regime. In just at less of a global level, in cities. For decades now, religious leaders have helped to lead resistance to undermining of welfare programs or whatever the local situation would be, a sense of, hey, there's something about our religion that compels us to fight on behalf of the weak, the marginal, the vulnerable, and so on. Then you have here the patriarch of the Russian Catholic, the Russian Orthodox Church, which since the decline of the Soviet Union, people like Putin would like to have a kind of Russian nationalism that grows closer to the church. And in India, we have Hinduism that has turned into a significant political party. And of course, we have in the world a whole variety of forms of militant, or however you want to label it, but let's say militant Islam that obviously is a major force of power and significance in the world today. So where some decades ago, religion would have thought to be a sort of a marginal, doesn't matter, irrelevant thing, since the late 70s, you can hardly think of a major geopolitical issue or problem or opportunity that's going on in the world today that doesn't have some significant religious dimension, if it's not essential to what's going on, the religious dimension. So we've had to throw secularization theory to the side and rethink what in the world is going on here? How do you explain this? So I want to give you a one account of how to explain this and keep the focus on religion. In my talk today, I want to, in order to help understand religion's power and its future, I want to first define religion, and then talk about why people practice religion, and then talk about religion's causal powers. That is, what does religion do in the world? What powers does it have to make things happen in the world, and where does that come from? And then think a little tiny bit about the future of religion. Reminder, I am a sociologist. I'm not a theologian. I'm not an ethicist. I'm not a member of the clergy. I'm a sociologist, so I'm here neither to promote nor to condemn religion. My job as a scholar is to try to understand it as best as I can and to explain its role in the world. So that's my positionality as I give this talk today. First, what are we talking about? What is religion? Scholars have been debating definitions of religion forever. It's a contentious topic among some scholars, and in fact, it's become so contentious that a lot of scholars have just given up on it, saying, we're not going to define this thing, it's impossible, it's too amorphous, whatever. Well, I don't agree with that, so I think I have a pretty good definition of religion here. Actually, my definition has benefited tremendously by the thinking of Martin Riesebrot, who is a former University of Chicago Divinity School Weberian social theorist of religion. So I'm very dependent upon sort of Chicago thinking. He has since passed on then, but he has a great book called The Promise of Salvation, who I'm relying on a lot here. So I want to give credit where credit is due. Martin Riesebrot is a really good thinker about this. So what are we talking about? Because our explanations of religion's power and religion's future are driven by our conception of what we're even talking about in the first place. So we need to think that through first of all. Unfortunately, it requires a really long definition to spell this out, but I'm going to break this down piece by piece, and I hope it makes sense to you. So first, religion is a complex of culturally prescribed practices. The approach that Martin took and that I take focuses on practices. A practice in this definition is a meaningful, repeated behavior. Humans engage in practices all the time. A practice is not a one-shot thing, and a practice is not something that has no meaning, like just scratching the back of your head. If you do that a lot, that's not necessarily a practice. A practice has a meaning. It's significant, and it's repeated. and it's an action. That's what makes a practice a practice. A lot of people have thought about religion in terms of beliefs, and especially Protestants tend to think about religion in terms of beliefs. You get the right beliefs, you get the right creed, you believe them, that's what makes religion religion. This approach says more, and people do have beliefs, and there are beliefs running in the background, but what really matters more are what practices people engage in. So religion consists of a complex, there's a lot of practices that are interconnected in religions, of culturally prescribed, meaning there's a culture or a subculture or a counterculture. There's some cultural system that prescribes these practices, prescribes basically, says, do this. When you have a baby, do that. When you get married, do this. Every Sunday, do that, right? Life is sort of organized by a culture that says, here's what you do at certain times and situations of life. So that's the first part. Those practices that are culturally prescribed are based on premises. So there are beliefs here, premises about the existence and nature of what we call superhuman powers. Superhuman is an unfortunate term. It's the very best term in terms of precision. It's a problematic term because then we start thinking about Spider-Man and whatever, but that's not what we mean here. What superhuman here means is this. These powers have the capacity to do things that people can't do. And the second qualification is people didn't invent them. And people didn't construct them. So there actually are certain superhuman powers, or if we think in these terms, we can conceive there are certain kinds of superhuman powers that humans constructed that can do things that no individual humans can do. I'm thinking about everything from the modern nation state to the internet to neoliberal capitalism, whole host of things that are much bigger. They have huge power to do all sorts of things in the world, but they're the product of human constructions. All right. For religion, the superhuman powers that the practices are oriented toward are those that have capacity to make things happen that people can't make happen, and people didn't construct them. They have their own existence, so to speak. That make sense? One other qualification, whether personal or impersonal. Some religions have superhuman powers that are something like persons. They have consciousness, they have will, they might have emotions. So theistic religions, Allah, the Holy Trinity, Yahweh, whatever the deity is, it has something like a personhood, a personality, or at least as we think analogically as persons, we think, well, God is something like a person, there has personal qualities. But some religions don't have that. What's involved is more, the superhuman power is more impersonal. Some, but not all of these, are Eastern religions, but we're talking about religions that teach things like the Tao, Dharma, Samsara. I'm not going to go into defining all these, karma, you probably have that. There's something above, and like say karma, which you may be familiar, there's something above and beyond and more permanent and more powerful than any individual life or even a state that can make things, that works, things just work a certain way. You can't resist it. You can't stop it. It's the way things are. It's a power. But karma isn't a personal judge, say, of how you've behaved. It's a power, it's a force, it's just a reality of the world. So the important point here, to not exclude religions that are really religions, but their superhuman powers are not personal. We say the superhuman powers, whether personal or impersonal. All right, you follow so far? What do those practices, why do people practice them? They practice them immediately because the culture prescribes them. Why does the culture prescribe them? Well, those practices are basically oriented toward gaining access to and to communicate with, or at least to align with, to get like in touch with and on the same wavelength or in sync with these superhuman powers. And that's what the practices basically do. They get people who are not aligned with, not in touch with, not resonating with, not on the same page with the superhuman powers. The practices, one way or another, are believed to communicate with, to open the window of communication with, or to get oneself on the same wavelength with the superhuman power. If we just put a period there, that would be a great definition of religion. I add another thing because I think that this is true. We could debate this. It's an empirical question, but why do people want to gain access to superhuman powers? Why do people want to communicate with superhuman powers? Usually, if you take these things broadly, it's in hopes of avoiding misfortune, obtaining blessings, and receiving deliverance from crisis. You have to interpret this very broadly. This could be your eternal destiny after you're dead. I don't want to squabble about this, but I think much of human religion, if you study it, has to do with, usually it's not like even my eternal destiny. It's like, what situation am I in now? They have to do with things like, most religions, most practices have to do with health, life, security, healing, safety. So these deliverances and avoidance and all that, what the religious practices are oriented toward can be everything from my eternal destiny to I'm late for a meeting and I need a parking lot, and you start praying that a parking lot opens up, right? So it can be everything from very immediate like that, and that we were sort of like, really? That's what religion's about? But for a lot of people it is. To just sort of, I feel really bad, I didn't study for this exam, I really need help. It can also have a therapeutic aspect to it, but anyway, this is the general definition. Religion is, just to run through it one more time, a complex of culturally prescribed practices based on premises about the existence and nature of superhuman powers, whether personal or impersonal, which seek to help practitioners gain access to and communicate or align themselves with these powers, in hopes. None of it's guaranteed. There are very few religions that are like gumball machines. You do this, you're guaranteed to get that. Most of them are like, you have the hope, you have the expectation, there's a trust that this will happen, of avoiding misfortune, obtaining blessings, and receiving deliverance from crises. Okay, so that's the definition. Let's move forward from there. Let's think a little bit about practices. There are so many practices that religions can prescribe. I'm not going to read through this whole list, but you can just sort of scan your eyes around here and see that there are so many different things. When probably for many of us, when we think about religions, we think, well, let's see, prayer, reading scripture, you go to worship, something like that. But really, religions can prescribe nearly anything. Almost any human activity is within the realm of possibilities of prescription for practices that are relevant too. So just a few visual examples here. Reading Holy Scripture and praying. And prayer can take a lot of different forms. A lot of practice, there are different sorts of practices, and scholars sort of sort them out. Some of the practices have to do with life event practices around significant transitions in life, getting married, bearing children, getting sick, dying, etc., right? These are like major life transitions, and religions usually have something to say about them, and not just an idea you're supposed to have in your head when that happens, but something you're supposed to do, a meaningful behavior, which is what a practice is. So reading scripture and praying, having a baby baptized. Imposition of, this is for many but not all Christians on right, the imposition of ashes. And what gets said by the priest when the ashes are put on the forehead is, yeah, from dust you have come, and to dust you will return. Remember that you are mortal. We are like the grass. Not all these things, now I'm elaborating on it, obviously, but this is the idea. So there's a belief that's embedded in this. There's a whole worldview that's behind this, but the core of the thing is a practice. And it's not just, again, this theme of mine, it's not just an idea in the head, it's embodied. If any of you have done this, and I have, it's a powerful thing. Ashes. Dead organic matter on your forehead that you wear for the day, and you'll be told, oh, remember you're going to be dead pretty soon. It's a powerful thing. Other, communal, not individual, but gathering, fellowship, praise, worship, prayer. These are other practices that many religions have a community aspect to them. Pilgrimage. Not every religion does this, but many religions have this idea. There are holy places, or at least there are holy treks. And you should, and a good religious practitioner at the right time in life will go do this thing. They will move their body through some space and arrive at some other space, right? And so this is a crucial thing. It could be that there's some special water at the end. It could be that the process of doing the pilgrimage itself is the experience. It could be that it's a holy city that's being gone to. It could be that miracles are believed to be expected to be performed at the end and so on. But pilgrimage is another sort of practice. Offering sacrifices, engaging in organized kind of processions together. These are food sacrifices. Not everything has to, religious practices can be of all sorts. Sex is not out of the possibility. There are various religions that have sort of fertility rites, or that have temple prostitutes, or what the West ended up calling temple prostitutes, et cetera, et cetera. So this is the theme here is nothing is necessarily off limits of the possibility, no human activity is necessarily off limits of the possibility that religions would say, engage in this way at this time, and it will have this kind of consequence. Not all the practices are like here's a really nice, isn't this sweet? Isn't that nice? Invite all the family members, etc. That's a lovely time. We'll all go out to brunch after. But not all religious practices are like that. There are some religions that involve the gods demand human blood. Humans are sacrificed. I've been to some of the sites where this has happened. It's a pretty interesting thing, but there's power involved here. Also, again, notice a lot of these things involve very primal elements of material: water, food, blood, stone, fire, etc. Okay, practices often evolve around them. The last one, and this is partly because I don't want to give this impression like, oh, aren't religious practices so nice and all that. Some religions are what we would judge to be kind of horrific, or at least they're demanding, or at least they involve huge sacrifice. This one is, anyone know what this one is? This is the pre-Israelite Canaanite religion of Moloch. So Moloch is a bronze statue of a bull that you burn a fire inside, and it heats up totally burning hot, and then firstborn babies are put in the bull's hands and are burned to death in a public ceremony. I just want to, I'm interested in religion, but religions can be all sorts of different things, not just nice baptisms. So, and this is another example of a culturally prescribed practice in order to get in touch with the superhuman power of, in this case, Moloch. Okay. Now let's think about powers a little bit more. If that's what religion is, what powers does religion have? Meaning, what can it do in the world? If we think about causal powers, we're talking about the capacity to make a change happen or to prevent a change from happening. That's what essentially causal powers are. The ability to make something happen or to prevent it from happening. Well, what are religion's causal powers? So here's the way I think about it. Once you get a religion started, so to speak, once you get it going, that is, you get a culture that says, we have these premises about superhuman powers, and if you do this, that, and the other practice, you'll be able to get in touch with those powers and accomplish X, Y, and Z. Once you get that started, then religions develop what we call emergent powers. It now produces the capacity to do new things, to produce new outcomes, to make new things happen in the world. Let's see if I can make this a little bit concrete here. Religions can give people identities. I am an X, we are a Y. It has the power to give people community. We belong together. I belong to this group. It has the power to provide meanings for people. Here's what reality is. Here's how the world is put together. Here's what the cosmos is all about. It has the capacity to provide cultural expressions, art, architecture, dance, all kinds of cultural expressions. It has the power to generate in people experiences, transcendent experiences, religious experiences, whatever. If there wasn't the religion, maybe they'd have a different kind of experience, but it wouldn't be what we call a religious experience, right? There are many ways that people can have community, but one thing I would argue is religions bring a particular kind of character to a community that makes it a religious community. Religions can provide legitimacy, like, no, the way we're doing things here, our king deserves power, and our priests say so. Our king is given power by the gods, say, would be one way to think about this. That's legitimizing an institution. Religions give human beings the power of social control. This is the way it's going to be done. You do it this way, don't do it another way, okay? I conceptualize all of this like a tree. This is just one metaphor image, but the idea here is that the trunk of the tree, the heart of things, of religion, is not community or identity. The heart of religion is practices that engage superhuman powers. That's what it is at its core, okay? But once you get the tree growing and it's nourished out of the community and the connection with superhuman power, then it can give rise to all sorts of new things like legitimacy and social control and experiences and meaning and community and identity. Religion has the power to generate these things in human life. And in some ways, it's one of the most powerful generators of identity and community and so on. There are a lot of scholars now arguing that it's not first that civilization and politics arose and then they had to invent priests to legitimate it. It's that religion was the first thing. Civilization is the product of religion, not the other way around. So there's something very primal and powerful about religious traditions. And then the next we need to think about, well, why would that be the case? Where does the power come from? But this image is just that religion can produce those powers, but it's grounded, at least in my theory, in the core of engaging in practices meant to get in touch with superhuman powers. Okay, so just quickly running through some of these. Identity can be personal, group identity, social identity. So here's one visual example. Here's a woman. What's her identity? I am a Buddhist. She has a place set aside in her house where there are offerings, there are candles, there are statues, and clearly for this person, it matters. Well, clearly, we can imagine that for this person, her Buddhism, part of who she is, identity, my very self is what identity is about, has to do with the religious tradition that she's part of and the practices that she engages in. Community. There's community belonging, there's solidarity, like it holds us together. It's a glue. Religion can be a glue that holds people together. Or social support. Many people rely on religions for social support. So here's just one example of that. Here's a football team. After the game, they're praying together. Like, what's going on here sociologically? Like, you think what in the world is this? The coaches, the players, probably half the people in the team don't even believe in prayer, and yet they're doing it. So there's something about religion that gets brought to the sport that helps to do what? Like, what are the functions of this? To create solidarity, to create a sense of oneness, to create we're all in this together, whether we win or lose, this is still a good thing. I mean, there's so many dynamics, causal dynamics at work here. But this sense of community. Meanings can involve moral order, like how is the universe put together morally, or cosmic or life meaning, or theodicies. A theodicy is how do you explain suffering? How do you make sense of suffering? And religions are one of the main ways that people make sense of suffering. So here we're talking about meaning here. Here's a ritual that people undergo called baptism. And this is not just like, oh, let's go out and do something fun in the country. This is like you have died to an old life and you have risen to a new life. You're a different person. Your past has a new ontological status in relation to your future, et cetera, et cetera. It's a practice, but it's embedded in a whole worldview, in a whole sense of who you are, what your community is, and what's meaningful in the world. Religions give rise to all kinds of artistic creations, aesthetic expressions, transcendent experiences, subjective for individual persons. So for some, that can be in worship and prayer. You can have a religious experience. There are many, many, many versions of this. I'm just sort of giving a few indications of the possibilities here. Legitimacy, again, this has to do with individual legitimation, like why should we follow this institution? Why is it legitimate? Why does anyone believe in this way of doing things politically or economically? Religion can provide the answer to that. Political legitimacy, historically, regimes have often relied on religion to explain why the rulers get to rule. But it can also be legitimacy of dissent. Religion's a two-edged sword in this way. Religion can say, the ruler is just, the ruler must be obeyed. It can also say, compared to God's law, say, the ruler is violating God's law and therefore must be challenged, and therefore protest is necessary for religious believers. So this is a more recent, here are people who say, on the basis of their religious commitments, that certain political practices are illegitimate and they're not going to put up with it. They're at least going to protest against it. Okay. Social control, obviously, human life can be chaotic. The question is, how do we order it and keep everything under some control? That can be done internally. People internalize and they regulate themselves. It can be done through interpersonal controls. It can be done through formal social controls. There's a lot of ways that humans control themselves and each other, and religion has the power to help make that happen. Here's a photo of a group of young, soon-to-be Mormon missionaries in Provo, Utah, being trained and being sort of formed to go out into the world for a year and a half. So the question is, how do you get a whole bunch of 18, 19-year-old guys at the sort of the prime when they should be in college and starting their businesses to decide to become brother X and go with a stranger to some place that they haven't chosen and not be able to talk with their parents, to go talk to a lot of people who for the most part think they're crazy and don't want to talk to them? How do you do that? Well, religion has the power to make that happen. And these guys do it, and most of them come back and say, that was the best experience of my life. You know, it really solidified this, and I learned about that, et cetera, et cetera. So religion has power to make things happen in the world. It goes back, in my theory, to practices, engaging trying to communicate with superhuman powers is the core. And then up from that can grow so many different new capacities to make things or to prevent things from happening in the world. Okay, let's see where I am on time. All right. Why do people do religion? Well, it just follows naturally from my definition. Individuals do religion for a lot of idiosyncratic reasons, like, well, I married this guy and he's that, so I guess I'll do that. Or I had this profoundly transformative experience and I can do no other than to now follow with that. There are lots of reasons why individuals do religion. But if we think sociologically in big terms, why our species does this, believes in superhuman powers and such, and then engages practices, it's an interesting puzzle. Why? Well, if you go back to my definition, the answer is pretty simple. First, people do religion in hopes that superhuman powers will grant blessings and prevent misfortunes and aid in crises. Skeptics and atheists and so on say, religion's just a crutch, it's for weak people and da-da-da-da-da. Well, it turns out that human beings are vulnerable. We are finite. We are limited. We don't know what's happening in the future. We can't control the news that we're going to get in the next minute about our family or our businesses or our bodies. If you think about the finitude and the vulnerabilities and the challenges and the difficulties of human life, it becomes less and less mysterious why, if people believed there were superhuman powers, they would be interested in having those superhuman powers help them. That's not mysterious at all. That's like totally obvious why human beings would be like that. It also turns out, and cognitive scientists have been saying this for a couple decades now, thinking religiously is not a weird thing for the human race. The kind of brains we have are very natural. It's very easy for humans to think about superhuman powers and for religion to be plausible. What's really weird for humans is to think scientifically. Like, let's take everything we believe and call it into question, and then let's put it into formal propositional hypotheses. And like scientific ways of thinking is really unnatural. To think the world operates religiously, and these are not religious cognitive psychologists, these are mostly atheists, and they're naturalistic. They say there really isn't a God, but human brains are really set up to think religiously. It's just the way it is. So this is a big shift away from old psychological, like Freud and these guys that were like, religion is for psychopaths and so on. Now, cognitive scientists are much more like, religion really what makes sense. And the human brain, it's very easy to generate religion for the human brain. So, given that, this is one reason human beings engage in religious practices. The other is that religion is able to generate all kinds of goods for humans that they like and want that I've described. Identity, community, meaning, expression, aesthetics, ecstasy, control, legitimacy. Religion has the power to provide so much that human beings like or absolutely need. It's impossible to be a human being without an identity. Like, who are you? I have no idea. I mean, you can't do that. You have to know to whom do you belong? Like, what is your community? What are you part of? I don't know, I'm just floating around as a non-entity. You have to be somewhere. You have to be with some people. We need identity, we need community. The point is not religion is the only place that provides that. You can get identity and community and all of this stuff from other places, but religion historically has been a central place this has come from, and even in the modern world, it's a powerful place for many people to find these sort of goods. So why are people religion? Because it provides them all sorts of things that they consider to be good. Now, what are the mechanisms? I'm going to burn through this quickly because I have a good 8 minutes left. The question here is, how does religion shape the world? So again, I'm trying to follow the theme of power. This question here is, how does religion make this happen? A lot of people tend to think very on the surface that religion works by teaching things that people hear and then they internalize and then they more or less act on. Okay, that's one way that things happen. Religious powers are exerted in many other ways. So here are just some quick examples. So prescriptive teachings is what I just described, but also social influence of network ties. People are oftentimes influenced just by their friends and relations and what's going on around them in terms of social networks, net of what they believe or what they heard taught. So religions can influence the world through social relational networks. Another is contextual ecological effects. This is really interesting kind of quantitative research that gets done that shows the outcomes of people's lives are affected not just by their individual characteristic, but by the ecological characteristics of the areas they live in. Okay, so for example, doesn't matter what religion you are, if you live in a county that has a high proportion adherence of Catholic or mainline Protestant, you're going to live longer than if you live in a county with a high proportion of evangelicals. Net of all sorts of other controls, you know, electricity used and average income and blah, all that, you control for all that. There's a context that religion creates an ecology, an environment at a county level that shapes like when you're going to die. I can point you to the article if you want to see that, but there are other things, like let's take it down. In high school, there was a phase when some religious traditions taught you should take a virginity pledge. And so scholars showed that virginity pledges worked sometimes and not others. When they worked is when a good number of people in the school took the virginity pledge, but not too many. So it's not what you did, it's not making a pledge, it's the ecology in which one makes the pledge has to do, like if almost nobody did, then it's like, well, why am I gonna, or if it's like everybody did, well, I can't mean anything. So the point here is a sociological one, the environments we're in, and religion can shape environment. Okay, I got 5 minutes, so I'm gonna keep going. Social service programs. Religions provide billions and billions and billions, maybe trillions in the US economy of goods through social service provision. That's a huge influence on the world, the way it is. It's a very specific thing, but it's very powerful. If you just suddenly took religions and evaporated them out of the US society, all sorts of things would just fall apart simply on number 4 account. Generating social capital. Maybe you've heard this term, social capital, are relationships of trust that people have with each other. More social capital you have, just like the more economic capital you have, the better off your life is generally going to be. Social capital is a good thing for democracy, it's a good thing for lots of things. The Harvard political scientist Robert Putnam has this older book now, but called Bowling Alone, in which he estimates half of all the social capital in the United States is generated by religious congregations. Okay, so that's a huge way that religion influences the world. It's very different from just, well, religion teaches me I should love my neighbor, so I guess I'll be a little bit nicer person. It's totally different mechanisms. Another is religious institutions secularized. So maybe you exercise at the YMCA or the YWCA. What does the C stand for? I mean, it used to be like Sunday school. It's been secularized, but there's this whole set of institutions that are out there because at one point some religious people started it for religious motives. And then if you start to think in those lines, there's a whole host of things. Like, where did Habitat for Humanity come from? Where did the Baptist hospital or the Jewish hospital come from? It's like just so much in the institution that in our society that religion has generated. Secular transposition of religious dispositions. Okay, this is something like, I'll just leave it at this. If you know Max Weber's Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, the argument is weird Protestant doctrine of eternal predestination by some Calvinists set up this whole thing that helped to generate modern capitalism. It's a transposition of one way of thinking to another. I won't go into it any more than that because I'm out of time. Institutional legal codes. Why is it that the United States until recently has been very like, who's allowed to get married legally? Heterosexuals. That's not just like a rational, like this is obvious in the world. It's a specifically religious heritage on legal codes. Direct interventions by religious authorities. Religious authorities, I mean, again, this is a long list of ways that religion forms the world. It's not just through it teaches and then people act on the teaching. It's all sorts of mechanisms. I won't try to talk about that. So, the future. Some, if not many, humans will continue to practice religion. Secularization theory is somewhat true, but not totally true. So, if we think, well, what's going to happen in the future of religion? Well, a lot of people are going to keep practicing it. Japan is from a lot of points of view, kind of a secular society, but there's still Shinto and other religions still are significant and people still practice it. It's not just going to disappear. Humans will continue to generate new religions. Anybody know what the Santa Muerta in Mexico is? A sort of a combining of folk Catholicism and a sort of ancient Aztec veneration and fascination with the dead. It's basically a new religion, and it's a significant religion growing in Mexico. All living religions will be internally, qualitatively transformed over time. So religious traditions, the idea of a tradition is continuity over time. In reality, things are always changing. They just do. There's no way not to. Here's an example of that. This is Liberty University with our beloved president speaking there. And if you know anything about the Falwells, so Jerry Falwell Jr. is a huge Trump supporter. Jerry Falwell Sr. was one of those photos up there, was like one of the founders of the moral majority. But for most of his life, Jerry Falwell Sr. was a fundamentalist who taught if you're a good Christian, you never get involved in politics. You save souls. Well, Jerry Falwell Sr. changed on that in the mid-1970s. So religions change, and so now we have, like, don't even get me started on the transformation of American evangelicalism, but this is just an illustration of that. Some religions will grow and some won't. They'll decline. So here's Joel Osteen's church in Houston. It's taken over a basketball arena. This is not secularization happening, folks. This is big-time religion. And then you have some religious traditions and so on, institutions that are dying or dead. And then you have atheism, which is growing. The number of non-religious in the US has grown immensely since 1991. Okay, coming down the home stretch. Beyond that, the future is hard to predict. It's just, if somebody tells you they know what's going to happen in the future, stop listening to them. So for example, in early modern Europe, if you would have thought, what's the future of Judaism? You could have been pretty not certain about that. But lo and behold, you go to New York City and there's Orthodox Jews, they're a significant presence, they're institutionally important, and not just in spite of modernity, but in part because of modernity, right? Cell phones, religious traditions can use modernity and not just resist it. Okay, one last thing, and then I really will be done, Lena. The demographic paradox. This is an important thing to get. Economically, the developed world has been and is somewhat secularizing. In some countries, there's a huge amount of secularization happening. But at a global level, religion is growing in the world population. How can you have secularization and the growth of religion at the same time? Well, the main part of the answer to that is demography in this. Religious people have a lot more babies. Secular people, when you get secular, is like, well, I don't want 5 kids, I don't want 2 kids, I don't know if I want 1 kid. And so the more secular societies stop having babies, so they're less fertile, so to speak. Religious people, there's something pronatalist about most religions, and so what you have is even if the world is going secular in some ways, the parts of the world that are not are having more babies, and sort of the aggregate result of that is the world becomes more religious, even though there are very powerful forces of secularization at work. Also, in some religious traditions are spreading in the global south. So in some, we've talked about what religion is and its promises and powers that it provides people and societies. We've talked about and how that helps to explain why humans practice religion. And we've talked about secularization theory and why it's only somewhat proven true so far. What happens now and in the future is fascinating and uncertain, but religion is going to be around and it's going to be a power. In various ways, at various times, it'll always be complicated, but the idea that religion you cannot worry about is ridiculous.
Hello. So Kelly and I will be circulating with 2 mics. We just ask that you please keep it to questions, no comments, and speak directly into the mic. So I have one house left right here.
Hasn't religion also contributed to wars around the world? Historically, wars have been started over religion, and will that continue and has continued to this very day?
Wars and religion, that's the question, right? So here's my thinking, which I think is correct. Religion has incredible capacity to start wars and to motivate greater intensity of wars and so on. That's true. That's absolutely true. However, qualified in 2 ways. One is actually another Chicago connection. Bill Kavanaugh of DePaul University, Lincoln Square, has a great book called The Myth of Religious Warfare, in which he analyzes very, very closely early modern war and shows the secular West has really been into the narrative that religion is so damn dangerous because it started all the early modern wars between Protestants and Catholics. And it's true at some level. A lot of early modern warfare was not exactly religious. It was driven much more by political and other forces. So if you're interested in that, it just needs a balancing. The received narrative needs a balancing out. The myth of religious warfare. I'll leave it at that. I mean, clearly, I'm not trying to say religion is pacifist the world over by any stretch. It offers a huge challenge. But I guess part of what I want to say is this. The conflict and violence that religion can generate. Religion can just as well generate peacemaking, reconciliation, and so on. It'll vary by the context, it'll vary by the historical period, but the point is, religion has multiple powers that can work in lots and lots of different directions. So, yeah, yes, I'll leave it at that. I mean, it's a huge, big discussion, but yeah, war is in today's world, and 9/11 was like a symbolic, like how could you get that out of your mind, vision of that. But it's very complicated, and some of the narratives that we've received are too simplified, put it that way. Okay.
We have a question here on the left.
You had a picture of Joel Osteen and an audience sitting in the stadium. Is that kind of community, or that style, in this case, of evangelical Christianity, capable of being politicized? Or is that spectator religion and not particularly political potential?
I don't know, Ken, what do you think?
I think it's not.
Don't let Ken get started talking, because, no, all right, so here, in the interest, so, in general, that kind of religion is capable of being politicized. Liberty University is an example of it. It was another slide. You have to study the particular religious tradition, the particular religious community. That's the Joel Osteen style. It's not about politics, it's not about conflict. It's mostly about therapeutic, feel better, or figure out your life, and spectator. But it's not impossible sociologically for large groups with a charismatic leader that's very media-oriented. It's not impossible for that to be captured by politics or to give rise to its own political interests. So I'm not somebody who believes in a positivist philosophy like, if you have this, then you'll have that. If A, then B. If X, then Y. Things are much open and fluid and lots of different possibilities, and we have to study particular contexts to see what are the actual forces that make whatever happens there happen there.
We have another question in the back left.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. I am of the opinion that all theology is practical theology. That is, if you have a really stupid theological idea that doesn't work, it's going to go away eventually. But I don't think I'm right on that. I don't understand why, for example, the prosperity gospel continues, because it manifestly doesn't work. But nonetheless, multitudes of people around the world embrace it eagerly, and we could come up with a great many other examples. How is it that these ideas keep coming through and keep lasting?
So, well, that's complicated. I mean, the answer to that is complicated. One has to do with the word hope. Remember I said nothing is guaranteed in hopes of. Human beings have I would say, an evolutionarily primal incapacity for living with despair and like things don't work. So there's always a readiness to hope for things. The other thing is human beings, and I don't mean this as a religiously slamming statement, it's just an obvious truth to me. Human beings are not that rational, not that evidence attentive. We're much more driven by identity, emotions, things we wish to believe. Again, cognitive scientists show immense biases we have. I mean, not just dumb people, us have immense biases in what we're willing to think and what we pay attention to. And I mean, members of my family, like they'll only see what reinforces what they already believe. So that's part of it too. And again, it's not just certain people, it's common to human cognition. It takes a huge amount of work to overcome those kind of cognitive bias. Another thing is, I don't know. You use the word works. Religion, how could people believe in something that doesn't work? Well, what we need to do is step back and say, what do you mean by work? And what are the criteria of something working? A lot of times we're imposing our criteria of whether something works or not when other people are working with very different sense of what works. So, does it work to sacrifice the firstborn child of X, Y, and Z family to a bronze statue? That doesn't work in any possible sense, unless you have overpopulation. But then you have to think about, well, works by what criteria? Who's deciding what works? So, and a lot of times we need to step back, now I'm repeating myself, is not just project what we think is workable, but take kind of an anthropologist from that point of view. What would make sense in terms of working? That's a totally incomplete answer, but those are a few thoughts.
We have a question, House left.
Thank you. Have you seen a correlation in decline in religion or secularization in societies where women have attained more rights or more control over their own lives?
Yeah, there is a correlation, but I'm not sure it's a causation, or it's an indirect, mediated causation. There are so many complicated factors that lead to secularization. One of them is sort of Enlightenment philosophy. One of them that some people argue is when the state takes on more and more responsibility to care for, like, welfare states in Northern Europe, say. You don't have to go to a church to be taken care of. Right? So there's a displacement effect. The more government takes care of human welfare, the less people need religion to do that. I mean, governments can't keep people from dying, but there's more of a direct correlation in this sense, but it's a very short-term, I would say American, mid-20th century sense, but it's very, very limited. It's not a huge dynamic, and that is, there was a time when, given this sort of male breadwinner ideology, there was a time when there were a lot of housewives who were not in the paid labor force, who had a lot of time to make religious institutions work. And then in the 70s, there's a huge influx of women into the paid labor force, which is a whole other discussion why that happened. But basically, if you're a religious institution, a lot of your free volunteer labor just disappeared. And now that somebody else is paying them, and it's harder to pull off a religious institution that's rich and thick and that has an awesome kitchen, however it would have been. So that's one very specific, but that hardly explains sort of secularization at a macro level. So it's definitely connected. The other thing is, religion is highly gendered. Everywhere in the world, except for Israel, women are more religious. And social scientists argue, why is that? What's going on there? So religion and gender is a huge topic of interest and importance and so on, but its connection to secularization is very complicated.
So we have time for just one more question in the center.
Thanks. I feel like you talked a lot about the religious aspect of the first part of your question, but in terms of the development aspect of it, development leading to secularization was the initial theory. It seemed like I didn't hear as much about, even though the world's religious population is growing, it seemed as though you were suggesting at the end that it isn't necessarily the place where development, which I realize is not necessarily, development is a whole other thing that you'd have to define. But it seems as though in the countries that you might consider to be more developed, like Western Europe or North America, secularization has increased,
yes,
which would seem to confirm the secularization theory. So I'm just wondering, and then you think about some of the countries in Europe that are backsliding, like Hungary or Poland or something like that, where religion is becoming a much bigger force. I would argue that they're maybe undeveloping, and religion seems to be tied up in that. So I'm just wondering, it seemed like the development piece of it didn't come up as much, and I was just wondering if you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, I barely got through what I had here. So secularization, I mean, this is a central concern of mine. I think it's fascinating. I guess I would just say it's very complicated. If you take, the question is, what is your paradigmatic case? If Western Europe is your paradigmatic case, you see things in a certain way. If the United States is your paradigmatic case, you see things in a certain way. There is definitely something about becoming more modern in the way the West has thought about modernization. Although then you have to think, what's the difference between modernization and Westernization? And what about Westernization has to do with enlightenment, which is a very particular Western kind of movement. Anyway, but let's think about other cases. China has been this mass, unbelievable growth, development, modernization case in the last 30 years. And religion has been growing and growing and expanding. So that's not that doesn't disprove what's happened in Europe, but it provides sand in the gears of this theory. So, and it's particular to the case. It's sort of the old communist ideology didn't provide the meaning, and a lot of these things. And so there's a lot of reasons for this, but there's vacuums of things that are going on precisely because China is modernizing and developing economically that has led to incredible growth in religion, not just Christianity, but including Christianity and other religions. So I guess my bottom line is, my theory in the book basically says secularization is happening. It is, absolutely, but it's not the only thing happening. There are many complex things happening, and depending on the civilization we're talking about, if you believe in that, such as the cultural tradition, what it means to come out of an Indian subcontinent civilization is very different than what it means to come out of an East Asia. So the cultural background matters, the particular relationship with states. Has there been a state church or not? So the United States is very different than Europe, where there were state churches and we haven't. So there's so many factors. So basically what I'm saying is, yes, but it's complicated. So, thank you.